Welcome once again to Strategies for Living with author and international speaker Doug Sparks. In this episode, Doug will be continuing his discussion of how we are to respond to postmodernity. And now, here's Doug.
Hello, everybody. Thanks again for joining us. Before we move forward, I just want to take a few minutes here and kind of circle back and maybe draw some conclusions. The main idea and the main theme and the hope of this podcast series is not so much to talk about postmodernism as such. My goal and objective in doing that and kind of outlining it was primarily to paint a picture of the landscape that is emerging into the Western world. And so my main approach here for the audience in the terms of who is going to be having to live through this transition, shall we say, are really the next 3 or 4 sociological generations below us, so below me. Now I'm just going to be 75 here in another month or so maybe quite a few generations below me. But if you're 50-ish or below, I'm guessing that postmodern integration is going to take another 10 or 15 years before it really hits in a big way. And so if you understand the landscape and you're prepared for what's coming, then it's really helpful for you to have your feet on the ground and be grounded. Then my hope is this, is that somehow it can be integrated. I think, as we talked about the other day, that there are, obviously capitalism has its strengths and its weaknesses. And there's a lot of stuff that needs to be addressed. Does it require the entire deconstruction, tearing down of everything? Or is there some way you can marry the two and come up maybe with a third way? I mean, we've been living in our present cultural boxes, as it were, for a couple hundred years. And maybe, especially with the technology and all the science and artificial intelligence and all the things that's coming down the pike more and more, maybe there's a third way. I mentioned earlier that I'm unaffiliated. My take on this is I think there's a lot of really good people on both sides of the aisle. And I think, and if you have a standard deviation sort of a model where you have the president's kind of a bell curve sort of thing, I think probably 80% of the folks there are good folks wanting to do the right thing, and then maybe 10% on each side you've got the radicals. So I wonder, it would be interesting to kick around the idea, is there room for like a third party? Is there room for common ground? Because I know there's a lot of really good folks out there that are confused and not knowing, they're not really satisfied with either the hard right or the hard left, and yet there doesn't seem to be any central voice or even a central place to stand where you can have conversation. And so maybe the idea here is that as you go in, now you're already into your adult life, that you try to really consciously prepare yourself to how can I get engaged? How can I do something? How can I be involved in terms of making this adjustment that we might have to make? And hopefully there's a third way forward. As an old man, I'm probably not going to be around here to see a lot of this going on. But my deepest concern is I know that if you take postmodernism literally and you really take the 3 French philosophers and take it to their logical conclusion, it's not a good ending. It doesn't end well because it ends up in pretty much total anarchy, and anarchy almost inevitably will produce some sort of violence. And to me, that would be catastrophic. And hopefully, and I pray that it doesn't go that way, but I'm a little bit skeptical of trying to think that, again, as we talked about the progressives 120 years ago, were setting the world up that it's going to be a wonderful, fabulous place and all ills will be cured and all suffering will be abolished and on and on and on, and that didn't turn out so well. And so now here we are 120 years later, and we've got the progressives saying the same thing, and they're saying, hey, trust us. I'm going, I think I'll be a skeptic on this one. I hope and pray that it would work out well, but if it runs its course, in my opinion, it doesn't end well. So hopefully, and that's what this whole podcast is about, is not postmodernity as such, but how do we manage it? How do we, in some ways, embrace it where it can be helpful, because we do need to change, but how do you manage that? And that will probably be not to me, but it's going to be up to you. And in order for your generation, whatever generation you fit into, you're going to have to become engaged in this. You can't be passive, and you can't be down in the basement playing video games, and you can't be laying on the couch, and you can't be anxious and depressed and removed from society. That's not going to help anyone. You got to really stand up, take your stand, take your ground, and get involved and make a difference. And so I wanted to just kind of reiterate that. So what we've talked about so far, basically, with both postmodernism, which has been the biggest part, that's just painting the landscape. And so what we're talking about from here on out is really the strategy for living. Now, a lot of you have got your act together, you're doing well, you're moving on, and yet there's a lot of you that are kind of lost in this postmodern fog in a way, because it is confusing. A lot of the things that we've considered to be solid ground have been challenged and have been in some ways eradicated. And so now we're trying to figure out what the heck's going on and how do we live a meaningful, a successful, healthy life that has meaning and value and significance. And so that's what we're kind of, from here on, we're going to be talking about that. What is the best strategy for living? Now, the other thing I want to circle back on just a little bit from yesterday's, or from the last episode, is one important fact. And we were talking about the idea of who are you? And sitting down and trying to figure out in a very intentional way, looking inside, being introspective. It's okay to do that for a while. You don't want to be a navel gazer forever, but there's times when you need to go really deep inside and figure out, who the heck am I really? The real me, not the one that I project to everybody around me, not the one that I want to throw out there so people like me, but who I really am. Now, part of that has to do with you doing self-inspection, but part of it also is what you've taken in from the outside of other people telling you who you are. And this usually comes in the way of what's called life messages. In other words, when you're growing up, you've got a lot of chatter coming in. There's a lot of voices that are talking to you, and whether they're parents or teachers or friends or whatever. And a lot of those messages just pass through. They don't stick. For some reason, they're not the ones that stick in our minds. But some of those messages do stick, and they end up defining who you are, and you will often live those out. Let me give you some example. We had a young lady with us on staff when we were living on the island of Cyprus, and she was about 19, 20 years old at the time, drop dead gorgeous. She was just a beautiful young lady, great spirit, nice, just had everything in the world going for her. You couldn't have, if you say, how would you improve her? I'd go, in my opinion, that's pretty doggone good. And then one day I literally almost fell out of my chair because she came to me and she was having some issues and some problems. And at one point she said, I just hate myself. And I thought, whoa, you've got to be kidding me. Now, I've got a lot of reasons to hate myself, but I don't see any obvious reasons why you would want to hate yourself. I didn't say that, of course, but I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is interesting. And I said, well, tell me what's going on. And so she said, when she was a little kid, she was going to school, and she was in the same school that her older brothers and sisters were in, and they were really smart, and she wasn't maybe quite as bright as they were. And one day in class, the teacher, when this girl had made a mistake, the teacher said to her, "You are so stupid." And she said, I still remember to this day. And now this is 15 years later, or some number of years later, and she could still recall that event precisely in her mind. And I had noticed that as altogether as she was, that she would often make unnecessary mistakes. She'd start to do something, and not clumsy, but it never quite worked out right. And I didn't really pay much attention to it at the time. But when she started telling me about this, I'm thinking, isn't that interesting? After all these years, she's got this life message that you're so stupid that she has not been able to move beyond it. And actually, she sort of lived this out. She didn't really progress in her education. She didn't move on, and didn't have an inquisitive mind. And so that life message that was given to her by a teacher on a specific time, specific date, stuck within her, and she was living it out. Now, it seems to, in my experience here, and talking and trying to help young people, especially who have these profoundly negative life messages, is it seems to come from somebody in a position of authority over them. So if somebody, one of her distant friends or somebody on the school grounds yelled across at her and said, "Oh, you're so stupid," it probably would have never happened. But a teacher who said that to her, it had this profound impact on her life. Now, oftentimes it's parents, and parenting is not an easy task. It's tough to do, and sometimes you lose your patience and you lose your cool. You get frustrated, and you say things to your kids that stick with them the rest of their lives. And if it's negative and hurtful, then it will impact the way they see themselves, and then consequently the way they start living it out. I remember a young guy who came up to me one time after I had given a lecture, and again, nice looking guy. You look at him, you think, wow, this guy's really got it together. And he said, "Can I talk to you for a second?" And I said, "Yeah, what's going on?" He said, "I hate my father." I said, "Oh, okay. What's going on here?" He said, "Well, my father died." And I said, "Well, I'm assuming he didn't have a choice on that." And he said, "No, he died of cancer or something." But he said, "I'm so angry at him because when I was little, he kept saying to me, 'You are no good. You will never amount to anything. You're worthless.'" And he said, now he's probably in his early 30s when I was talking to him. He said, "I have worked so hard. I've busted my butt. I've become successful. I'm rich. I'm this. I'm that. And my dad goes and dies on me, and I have nobody to prove anything to anymore." And I'm thinking, wow, that's profound. Now he's empty. I mean, he's got everything, everything in the world, money, success, that. But the one person who told him he was never going to be any good, he's worthless, died, and now he's empty. And so these life messages become profoundly important to us. As we grow older, we've got to be careful that we're not living out somebody else's life message that was imposed upon us. And I can give you just a quick little test you can run on yourself to see what your life message is. Works something like this. Now, this is not terribly scientific, but in my 50 years of experience, it seems to be a pretty good indicator of what your life messages are. And it's this: when you do something wrong or stupid, a silly mistake, which we all do. There's a guy named Richard Rohr, and he's a Catholic priest, but also a philosopher, and he writes a bunch of stuff. And he was one time talking about something like humility or something. He said, I pray every morning that God would humble me throughout the day or sometime in the day. And I'm going, man, I can do that before breakfast a half a dozen times. I don't need any outside help. We all make stupid, silly mistakes. But when you make that mistake, what do you say to yourself? What is your self-talk on that? You make a mistake, and you say, you know what? I'm only human. I make silly mistakes. Not a big deal. It's I'm fine. Or do you say, oh, you idiot? I tell you, golf is a good way to bring this out. That for some reason, golf has this magical way of hearing guys on the golf course talk to themselves after they make a particularly bad shot. Is on one hand is quite hilarious, because anybody else talked to them like that, they would beat them up, or do something. But they call themselves the worst possible names, and obviously that isn't always the sign of their life message. They just might be mad at their bad swing or something. But in general, when you do something wrong, what do you say to yourself? And that is often the life message that you have internalized, and that's basically what you think of yourself. And it's not helpful. Let's put it that way. It's not helpful for you to think of yourself as a stupid idiot, can't do anything right, and on, whatever that message is. And so that also, as we talk about trying to get yourself in a position where you can make an impact in your world around you, I think it was Archimedes, the Greek mathematician, that said, give me a lever, or lever if you're British, give me a lever and a place to stand, and I can change the world. I can move the world. Now, need two things. You need a lever, whatever that might be in your life, but you also need a place to stand. In other words, you've got to be fully and completely and totally grounded as best you can. And I think one of the things about postmodernity is it's de-equalized, it's destabilized the ground on which you're standing, because for many years it seemed to be solid ground, and now it's more like quicksand. And so trying to orient yourself, trying to find a place where you can place your feet so that you can stand firmly to use the lever maybe of truth and other characteristics you have in order to really leverage that to change or move the world that's in front of you. And so I would encourage you at some point, and again, this idea of introspection and looking within, you need to ask yourself, what are my life messages? What do I say to myself? Do I believe that? And the other thing is it true? And 99% of the time, it's not true. And so you have to, in that sense, you have to deconstruct that. This is where deconstructionism isn't such a bad thing, because you can deconstruct that false narrative, that life narrative that's not true, and you can deconstruct it in such a way by taking it apart. Like this young man whose dad said, you're worthless, you're never going to amount to anything, blah, blah, blah. He can say, okay, that was the message that I got, but the reality was quite different. The reality is I worked hard, I applied myself, I used my character, I did all these things, I did it right, and I was successful. So that narrative is not true. And so the next time you make a mistake and you start to call yourself these names, you just need to literally, physically stop yourself and say, oh, wait a minute here. That's not who I am. Maybe somebody else thought, but that is not who I am. Now, if you are really stupid and lazy and okay, you probably need to take a few steps back and start from the ground, start from the beginning, and work your way up. But hardly anybody's that. And so those life messages are really important. Take time, sit down, and oh, by the way, it doesn't take long. They'll surface if you can just quiet your mind, sit there, and ask yourself, what were my life? What did I embrace? What was impactful upon me? That was a narrative, a story about who I am, and is it true? Is it real? If it's not, then begin, and it'll take time. It's a process. You don't just do it once and it goes away. You just have to make a habit out of it. When you do something silly or stupid, then you start negating yourself and talking to yourself in a negative way. Just say, oop, hang on here, just a second. That's not the right story. That's the false narrative. I'll do the real narrative, and it's this. I'm not perfect, but I've made, and I'm doing this, and I'm doing that. I've got this going on. And pretty soon that negative narrative will get quieter and quieter. And the real you can then has a way to step forward and begin to express yourself on the world. And by the way, as I mentioned earlier, if we have the next 3 or 4 generations that can get themselves together, really get their acts together, really get in a position where they can take on the world and use those levers that are available to you, the world can be changed for a much better place. And I'm not saying it doesn't mean, no, let's become all capitalistic or let's become all postmodern. Maybe we talked about Hegel a little bit, the German philosopher. Maybe he was more right. He was right about a lot of things. He had a lot of good stuff to say, but remember, he was the one that dialecticism, where you have 3 movements, where you have a thesis and then you have the antithesis, and those kind of collide, hopefully not through revolution, but they collide, hopefully peacefully, and then out of that comes a synthesis, a third way. And so maybe between the capitalism and the postmodern, if you're well grounded and you know the landscape and you're well prepared and you're a reasonably healthy, responsible young adult or old adult, then you can engage the culture and society around you, and you can actually make a difference for the better. Because let's be honest, nobody wants more poverty in the world, right? Nobody wants more suffering. Nobody wants more of the negative stuff to go on. That's self-evident. Anybody that's halfway in the world doesn't want that. And so, as they say, evil always prevails when good people do nothing. And so, not that you want to necessarily paint one thing as evil, but potential radical change, potential disruptive things can be mitigated, and you can find maybe a third way that's even better than either one of those two on their own. But in order to do that, you have to have not only a good self-awareness and a good healthy being, you've got to also have a strategy for living. And that's really what we're talking about over these next episodes, will be how do you put together the best strategy that you can possibly have to maximize the potential that's within you. And every human being alive has this latent potential. It's not who you are today that's so important, but it's who you can be tomorrow, who you can be next month, next year, in a decade, when you're 50, when you're 70. That's the potential you. And so you're starting today with the real you, who you are now, but there's so much that's possible within you to be something truly great and important and meaningful and significant life. Each one of us have that potential within us. It's the latent potential that has to be and should be and hopefully will be activated in such a way that we can bring about a better world. I think if we all stood up together and say, how many people would like to have a better world, we'd all raise our hands and say, yeah. And now the question is, well, how we go about doing that. And so that will be the next series of episodes that we're going to talk about is, how do you take that latent potential of who you are and extract it out of that, the person that you want to be tomorrow, next week, a year from now, 10 years from now, and then all the way through to you're in your old age. So it takes a strategy, how you're going to do it. And so in the next episodes, we're going to be taking that on and talking about that. So I hope you'll be able to join us and come back and find out how you can have a strategy for living. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Join us next time on Strategies for Living with Doug Sparks.